Okay, so let's kick things off. So good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. And firstly, thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. For those of you that haven't joined our webinars before, my name is Sally McDonald, and I'm one of the Client Services Directors here at Alterian, based in our Bristol office. This month on our webinar series, we're actually shifting back to the hints and tips part of our programme, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce you today to Mike Ashton. Mike joined Alterian in 2013 after previously being a marketing data analyst and is one of our data consultants that works within our professional services team in Bristol. Today, Mike will be taking us through the Alterian developed data load framework and explaining our approach on how to ensure real efficiencies in this process. But there will be some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions that you can think of during the presentation, then if you are happening to be logged in via your PC, you'll find the Q&A section at the top of your screen. And if you can't find that, then please do email myself at customersuccess@alterian.com, as I'll be monitoring this inbox during the presentation as well. Lastly, we'll be recording the session for you guys to refer back to, so please don't worry about making tons of notes unless you'd like to. And I'll make sure that the webinar recording is distributed next week with the links via our usual email program. So with all of that said, I'll now hand over to Mike, who will be running through his presentation today. So over to you, Mike.
Good afternoon and good morning. So today I'm going to go through the Campaigns Data Integration Framework. The rough agenda for this session is I will introduce the framework and say what the framework is. We go through the update process as a whole and show you how the framework fits into this. Then we go over the framework and give a good overview of what it is and what it does. We then drill into how you might go about configuring our framework, and then the data file processing that will happen on a typical example. We then look at how the data load works, and then we'll follow up with any questions. So what is the CDI framework, which is the Campaigns Data Integration Framework? So it's really a collection of Pento data integration jobs and transformations. This used to be called Pento Kettle, that interact with Alterian plugins that have been developed by developers that interact with Campaign Manager and Engine. So really, we use Pento Kettle or Pento Data Integration to control the workflow of loading data into Alterian Engine by interacting with our plugins. So Pento Data Integration, if you haven't heard of it, is open source software. So it's readily available on the internet to download for anybody. And we just use plugins specifically designed to interact with files and load data into our solution. So essentially the framework is what we use to get data into Alterian Engine in a safe and controlled way. So the prerequisites for the framework: we require Kettle version 5, Java version 8, access to an SMTP server. So the reason why we need this is that we send out email notifications saying the progress and any success or failures within the data load. We require the Alterian Campaigns External Integration Pack, which has all the plugins required to load data and interact with Campaign Manager and Engine. Notepad++ is desirable. We use this internally for creating our iLoader scripts and text highlighting. Also, in order to implement the CDI framework, a working knowledge is assumed of Kettle, Alterian iLoader, Engine, and Campaigns, and a basic knowledge of ETL is really desirable. So the solution refresh overview then. So this diagram really depicts a typical refresh cycle and the interaction between a client and the framework. What would typically happen is a client will prepare some raw data and send that to us. That could be via FTP, or that could be via Amazon S3. And that data will be received by us in the data in location. Once that data has been sent over, the client will then create a trigger file to say that the data has been successfully transferred over to us. We will then do some pre-check, so we will stop Campaign Manager. We will pause all campaigns that are running, and we also wait for a trigger file up until a certain point, so that we don't partially load partially transmitted data. In the pre-processing step, we then have an opportunity to do some custom processes depending on the customer's requirements. So this could be something like extracting data from a source, but it also could be transforming data or something like that. We then move on to process the data files. So initially we verify the file layout. What we actually do is check the first 150 rows of data and just make sure that there's the right amount of columns based on the delimiter that we've specified. If we're happy with the file layout, we will then go on to load the data into Campaign Manager. And once all of the data files have been loaded, we'll then do data engineering, followed by any custom processes. So custom processes could be something like sending back campaign history files to a client site so that their data warehouse can consume the data. We will then finally resume the campaigns and do any housekeeping tasks. So this might be something simple like deleting log files, for example. So the framework itself. So the framework looks something like this. So this is opening one of the CDI framework.kjb file in Spoon. So Spoon is a graphical user interface that allows you to design and create jobs or transformations within Kettle. So initially, we set up the framework ready to run. So we get the current date time, we get all of the configuration settings that's just stored in a config.xml file, and we then set them as variables. We will then create a log folder named with the date time, and we will subsequently put any logs to do with that particular refresh in that folder. We'll then archive any of the previous logs. We will then send out some start emails just notifying the admin team and the end user that the CDI process has started. We then go on to pause all campaigns, we disable the data source, and then shut down engine. We then back up the client repository. So we've got a few options for this, but the one we currently use is we snapshot the entire disk because it's run on Amazon AWS. We then run bespoke preload. So this is an opportunity for us to build in any custom preload things for a client. I mentioned earlier, it could be something like transforming data or extracting data from a different system. We then execute a preload script. This typically would be dropping all derived fields, for example, but it could be doing some custom processes as well. We will then wait for the trigger top file up until an agreed point with the client. If the trigger file is not delivered, we will then not load any data and then start the product back up and give it back to the client with the data from yesterday in it. We will then load the data. So for each data source, we'll process all files and we'll update a last update date and config file for each file. So it allows for consecutive loads to be enforced. We will then run some post-load tasks. So this will be things like data engineering, so creating aggregates, expressions. So we actually have two iLoader scripts which will run here, finishing.mta and postload. Finishing.mta will only run if we've loaded data, and postload.mta will run regardless of whether we've loaded data or not. We will then start back up the product, so we'll resume campaigns and enable the data source. We will then do some post-refresh tasks, so it will initially send a completed email with all attachments. So we have attachments saying how many files we've loaded, what those files are, and any files not loaded because, for example, they might not have passed the validation. We will then run bespoke post-processing. So this has an opportunity for us as PS to do any bespoke tasks. So this could be sending out some data to the client's FTP site to be consumed by their other systems. Okay, so configuring the framework. So all the settings for running the framework are configured in an XML file called config.xml. In conjunction with these settings, the framework also assumes a certain folder structure and files exist in order to operate correctly. We then run a batch file called runcdi framework.bat that also needs to be configured, and we can then call that batch file from Windows Task Scheduler. So the iLoader script folder assumes the following layout that's on screen. So we require a file to be called preload.mta. This is a control script that runs other scripts, and it will subsequently call scripts within the procedures or bespoke folders. So this would be things like dropping all derived fields, for example. We'll then have a load folder, which will contain all of the customer's data load scripts. We'll then have a finishing script, which runs any finishing scripts. So this would be things like creating links, aggregates, and expressions. And this script is only executed if data is loaded. Postload.mta, so this runs regardless of data being loaded. This can run any API calls or anything like that that might need to be ran from the procedures or bespoke folder. So as I mentioned, procedures contains all the standard procedures. So this is reusable code that we use, and we would just pass parameters into these scripts. So these are things that we typically would do quite often with projects. So we've got procedures to deal with it. The bespoke folder will contain scripts specifically designed for that project or client. Things like repository links, for example. Okay, so what the framework actually does in the setup IDI, it will read a config file that will look something like this, and it will read all of these settings and set them in as variables in the framework. So all of these settings can be subsequently used in the job itself. So you'll see, for example, we've got some SMTP details there, and we've also got trigger file details and trigger file timeout details and what have you. So we will do all the tasks as I mentioned earlier, but in the load data, it will then go within the config.xml and look at all the settings there and read in the settings for each file and validate each file against those settings. If it passes the validation, we'll then load the data. So we've got two types of loads that we use, load by feed and load by date. Load by feed is files are loaded one at a time. If one file fails validation, the process will continue with the next data feed. Load by date, all files within the same day set are validated. If one file fails validation, the whole set is rejected. So this is where files are dependent on each other, and we don't want to load data if any of the data files don't pass validation. Okay, so I'm going to go over how load by feed would work by interacting with the config.xml. So we will read a config.xml file. In the bottom right hand corner, we have the data in folder. So we've got 4 files called product. We also always request the files to be date stamped, either as a prefix or a suffix. We will read the config file for product. The last update date you will see here is the 15th of the 1st, 2015. So we only expect to load newer files because we have consecutive load set to Y. So we're expecting to load files dated the 16th onwards, and consecutive load tolerance 3 simply means that we will only load data dated the 16th, 17th or 18th. So is the file within the tolerance? No, it isn't, because it's actually too old, because the last update is the 15th. We will then move that file to the reject folder. We will then check the next file. So is the file within the tolerance? This particular file is within the tolerance. We will then go on to check the format of that file. So is it in the right format? In this case it is, so we'll then go on to load the data and we move that to the archive folder. We will then update the last update date in the config, so it's quite subtle on the presentation, but that number's changed from 2015-01-15 to 16. And that then allows us to check for the next consecutive dated file. So we then say, is the next file within the tolerance? Is it the right format? In this case, it's failed the validation checks because it's got too many pipe delimiters in the file. So it might have too many columns in, for example, so I'm going to reject that file. We will then look at the next file, which is the 20th. In this case, it's actually too new. So because we're expecting only the 17th, 18th or 19th, and this one's dated the 20th, we're not going to load that, but we're not going to reject it either. We're going to leave it in the data in folder. This then gives the customer the opportunity to backfill the data. So if you think if you're only providing incremental updates of data, this would just cater for mistakes in delivery or what have you. So the total flow looks something like this. All the files that we do load, we write to a log file, and all the files we don't load, we also write to a log file, and we then attach those files at the end of the refresh process to an email and send it to the client so they're aware of any files not loaded and files loaded. Okay, so how do data loads work? So once a file has been validated, an iLoader script's called from an Auterion plugin based on the script name in the config.xml. So here we've got the script's name. We will pass that script's name as a variable into the iLoader plugin, and we will also pass in the load file name into the plugin. So you'll see in the config file in the top left, we've got a feed mask for what the file should look like. So we're expecting a date and underscore product. We will read the folder and then pass in the name. So an example here would be that we pass in process the DWH refresh product.mta, and then we pass in the file name as a variable. So that then gets passed to an iLoader script that looks something like this. This is an iLoader load script. That file name will get passed in as para1 into the iLoader script. We will then set that as the load file name. We will then be able to pass that load file name into the below that file. So that really just passes in the full path of the file so we can load the data in. So how do we run it? We run it in Windows Task Scheduler, and we schedule that to run on a nightly basis, but it is dependent on the client's requirements, depending on what time we kick it off. The schedule task calls the configured batch script to run, and the batch script subsequently will call the framework job that you've seen in the presentation called CDI framework.kjb. And that runs from something called kitchen.bat. So great, thanks for your time, everybody. So I'll open up the floor to any questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. Very comprehensive presentation, so thank you so much for that. And as you were running through that, we did have a couple of questions come through. So I'm just going to quickly go through those. So the first question I had was, how easy is it to learn Kettle and the framework, in your opinion? How long did it take you to get up to speed with the process?
So the framework itself is designed to be black box. So all you're actually required to do is to edit the configuration file.
Okay.
And the framework will actually work. However, if issues arise during the load process, you need to be able to interpret what the log files say and output it by the framework to debug or resolve any issues. So Pento Kettle itself is really intuitive, and it being open source, there's lots of online resources available to learn how to use it. So if you want to implement any customized processing, for example, you should be able to do it without the need for getting programmers involved.
Okay. Did you go through a course as such, or is it?
I didn't. No, it was all learned internally, to be honest.
Okay, great.
And using the online resources.
Perfect. Okay. So the second question that I had through was, in your experience, how long does it take to implement the framework? So actually taking it from the framework that we've already got the bare bones of and actually implementing it.
So the framework itself is extremely quick to roll out, as it's simply a collection of Kettle files within a certain folder structure that interact with iLoader scripts based on the details set in the config file. So for setting up new clients, I mean, you could do it within hours or within a day. However, if you're porting across existing projects, so if you've got existing clients that you want to move on to the framework, the time will need to be spent restructuring your current load process to match the structure to run in the framework.
Of course.
but the answer is very quick if it's a new project, but the time may need to be taken just to fit with our processing structure.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to have one quick look to see if there's any last minute questions. So looks like we're all good on that. So as I wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you so much to everyone for joining the webinar today. Mike and I hope you found it useful. And Mike, as well as other colleagues in PS and your usual customer and partner services contacts, would love to hear more from you. So if you've got any further questions or anything you've seen today, any projects that you'd like to discuss, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email address is customersuccess@allterion.com. And I'd also love to hear from you if you have any further ideas for future subjects and content, as we really want to make these very specific to supporting you guys, our users of our tech and our services. So on that note, I'll wrap up and say thank you very much, and hopefully see you on next month's webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.